Hi there, and welcome to the Surviving and Thriving in Residency podcast. I'm Charley Lowry, your host and director of GME Relations at PracticeLink. This show is all about exploring the world of graduate and undergraduate medical education. We'll dive into the real-life experiences, successes, and challenges faced by medical students, residents, and fellows, while also highlighting valuable tools to support you, whether that's financial planning, student aid, or the many free resources provided by PracticeLink. If you're thinking about med school, currently studying, or deep into residency or fellowship, this podcast is here to offer insights and support to make your journey a bit easier than those before you. I am your host, Charley Lowry, and I'm the Director of GME Relations at PracticeLink. And today I have with me a very special guest, someone that I actually got to work with a little bit during his medical school years. I have Scott Gay, who is an attending physician in the Division of Resuscitation and Emergency Critical Care at Prisma Hospital, upstate in Greenville, South Carolina. Dr. Gay, how are you doing today? It's good to see you.
I'm doing very well, Charley. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Absolutely. So I'll tell you a little bit about the podcast. So with PracticeLink, of course, I've worked in the medical education field for a while. And so with PracticeLink, we want to fill a gap with graduate medical education. So what I do is I travel around and I talk to residency programs, residents across the country, and even medical students about how to find their first job, because we felt that there was maybe a gap there where while you're in medical school, they really don't talk about your first job and how to find your first job and all of that, what all's involved in it, contract negotiations, things like that, so it kind of hits you hard once you're finished up. You're doing it all on your own. So that's a little bit of background with some of what I do, but the podcast itself, I'm hoping will go out to medical students and residents throughout the country, and they can listen and they can hear about your journey and maybe make their life just a little bit easier. Questions they may have, you might answer with just talking about what you've been through and what it's taken to get to where you are.
That sounds awesome. That sounds like something that's very, very needed.
I think so. I think it'll help a lot of folks. So I'm just going to kind of kick it off with just asking you, what made you decide to become a doctor, and how early in your life did you know you wanted to pursue medicine?
It's a really good question. My path to medicine was certainly a little convoluted. I knew pretty early on that I wanted to be a doctor, but had no idea how to get there. I have really no physicians in my family. One uncle is a dentist, but aside from that, really no physicians in the family. And didn't really know how to get to that. And when I was 15, I started doing some work on our local ambulance and really fell in love with the field of medicine at that point. I worked fairly straight through in pre-hospital emergency medicine through most of my time before medical school. But actually, when I was 19, I blew my back out. And I spent about 3 to 4 years on a walker. And during that time, I got a lot of the patient experience. And that patient experience really led me, once I was able to get back to a mobile state, it really led me to want to enter a career in medicine and enter with a resolve like I hadn't had before, after having some both good experiences and not so good experiences.
Wow. It's a horrible thing to blow your back out, but that gives you the patient perspective, right? Going into it before you even start training. So, that's pretty incredible, right? You have a takeaway that a lot of people don't have until later on in their career, I'm sure.
At the time, it wasn't certainly something I saw as beneficial, but as I was kind of proceeding through everything, it has become more evident by the day.
Sure. Now, I know it's been a few years, not too long, though. Tell me about the medical school application process. How did you find WVSOM, and what made you choose, in the end, to choose the osteopathic route?
Yeah, during my patient experience, I got to experience both allopathic and osteopathic physicians. And one thing I found with the osteopathic physicians is they cared a lot more about me as a person, it seemed, at times, and kind of cared more comprehensively about me. I didn't know much early on in my career about the osteopathic profession. One of my first mentors in the emergency department when I was working at maybe 17 years old, he was probably, and still is, one of the best emergency physicians I know. He was an osteopathic physician, and that really started to open my eyes to this path. And when I was applying, you have kind of that decision between whether you want to apply allopathic or osteopathic. And for me, I really did like that more kind of comprehensive care of the patient. I liked more of the personal side of things. I love and still do love forming relationships with my patients. And that made the decision pretty obvious for me. After my back injury, I did a national deployment with the American Red Cross. I went down to where there was this big supercell tornadoes in Alabama. And while I was there, I actually met a graduate from the school. He was in his fellowship at that time, but he and I kind of connected, and that was the first time I learned about WVSOM. And when I interviewed, I came to town, and I really wasn't sure what to expect. I had not been down to Lewisburg, West Virginia from Pennsylvania ever. And when I came there, Charlie, it felt like home. You know, I met people such as yourself that really made it feel okay to be so far away from home. It was a place that I saw students succeeding, and I thought that I would have the best chance of success at WVSOM, and really just fell in love. I interviewed, and the day was not like a traditional interview. It really just felt like getting to know what would become my future family.
Oh, that's so nice. I think WVSOM is a very special place for sure. Even the town itself, there's not a lot of distractions there for sure. But I feel like the town is really a community. Everybody knows everybody and people look out for you, and just a rare find for sure.
Very much so. You know, I still remember walking down Main Street there and going to the little coffee shop in town, and people would ask, "Oh, are you applying to the Oath School?" And they would welcome you to town, and it was just, it was nice. It felt like the whole community was behind you, both in the school and out of the school.
So in medical school, when you look back on your medical school training, does anything stand out? Any kind of hurdles, any kind of maybe challenges, or what were the biggest challenges maybe you had in medical school?
For me, one of the biggest challenges was the transition from learning as an undergraduate to learning as a medical student, in that, you know, oftentimes in undergraduate education, you learn for an exam and then you kind of forget things. You know, you're learning first order, maybe second order things. And when I got to medical school, I was very, very quickly overwhelmed with both the volume and the depth with which you have to know things. And probably the first hurdle for me was learning how to learn. And I utilized one of the resources on campus to help with that, because it was very different. You know, I was a little non-traditional, having my back injury, going back to medical school a little bit later. I was non-traditional. So for me, like, the learning strategies I had in undergraduate were not going to serve me well in medical school. And really in our first course, which was a foundations type course, I used that as an opportunity to start developing my study strategies, which still to this day, having completed medical school, having completed residency, and now a fellowship, are still strategies I utilize and are still strategies that work for me today.
So definitely word of advice here would be to take advantage of any resources that are offered on campus, for sure.
Those resources were invaluable. I think so often, you know, society, there's this stigma associated with reaching out for help. But one of the best things I could say is reach out, and reach out often, because that's how we get through this.
And oftentimes the people in those offices that help you, they're there for a reason, that they choose to be there. That's their passion. So they truly do care. Okay, so let's talk about how many residencies did you apply for? How was that process for you? And maybe how many interviews did you go on?
So when I applied for residency, and this is something that has since changed thanks to the global pandemic, but all of our interviews were all in person. So I applied to, if I remember the number, somewhere between 50 and maybe 100 residency programs. Ended up having 13 interviews, all of which I ranked, and those were all in-person interviews. At that time, I think somewhere between 11 and 13. It was kind of that magic number that they recommended for residency applications. And I could have gone on more. I did have more invitations, but I ended up declining some fairly early to give other folks the opportunity for areas that I did not want to train.
And that's an expensive process that people, I think, sometimes don't realize the expense and all the travel and all of that's involved in that.
Yeah, the travel, the hotels, the food, kind of all of that, going all over the country. I think I went all the way from Detroit to Baltimore, Maryland, and a lot of places in between.
Yeah, definitely helping people out post-pandemic. You know, virtual interview is much cheaper than an in-person. Yeah.
Absolutely. You know, favorably, some of the places that I did audition rotations at actually did interviews while we were on site, so that saved a little bit of the travel. But as a whole, it was a very, very busy year with a lot of miles on my Toyota RAV4.
So you did your residency at Geisinger, and how was that?
You know, residency was a very interesting time. Residency, it's kind of where you make that big, big leap from the learning in medical school to now learning in residency, which was another hurdle because now you're working very long hours. You're working all over the place. When I started residency, it was before the pandemic when I was an intern. And then about halfway through is when the pandemic hit. So I had a couple different experiences throughout that. It was like drinking from another fire hose, like they say with medical school. But generally, it was a very, very beneficial experience. Geisinger was one of the first major trauma centers I went to when I worked on the ambulance. So to be able to train there, one of the older residency programs in the country, was pretty fantastic.
And then for specifically first year residency, I hear a lot that it's a very lonely time. A lot of just working, going home, eating, sleeping, going back to work. Tell me about that.
That's challenging. I feel like, especially in emergency medicine residency, where shifts are 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, it's very, very hard to have a time where all your residency class is off at the same time. Outside of maybe that first month where you're focused on just more of like an intern boot camp style. Generally, you are never off with all of your co-residents at that time. And it can be a very isolating time. Very, very isolating because you're working long hours. When you're not working, you're tired. You're trying to sleep. You're trying to fit in some wellness, which is one of the most important things I feel to the overall medical education process. Because it's very, very easy to neglect yourself, neglect your well-being for the process of medical education. And it's truly a marathon, so you can't really be doing that.
So what did you do to fight that? What were your outlets? I mean, most people say they went to the gym, or maybe they found a church life or something like that, or talked to family a lot. So what were your outlets there to battle that?
Yeah, so one thing I was recommended really early on, I think in first year medical school, was to kind of create a non-negotiable list, which was a list of things that I would do kind of every week, no matter what. Regardless of how busy it was, regardless of how stressed I was, regardless of kind of anything, these were things. And a lot of this did involve, talking to and or seeing family. This was the first time in 5 years that I was back close to my family home, which was just a little bit away from Geisinger. So being able to see family, communicate with family was very, very important. Also, finding a spiritual home in a church community was really important for me, just to kind of help connect with that deeper purpose for me. And then finding physical hobbies that were not as much isolative as just me kind of going to the gym by myself at 2 a.m, but they were social things. So, I got involved with pickleball. I got involved with a whole lot of things kind of throughout training that I still do to this day. But really, the big thing for me was trying to connect with the community, because it's really, really easy to feel like just a transient member whenever you're at the different stages in your training. You're here for 2 years, you're there for another 2 years, you're in residency for 3 years. And it's very, very easy to not feel a part of, which I think kind of contributes to that isolative feeling during medical training and beyond. And I think trying to set down roots is really important. When I was able to really try to ground myself in the community through different community organizations.
Such a great point. I don't think anybody's brought that up, but that's such a great point. I think that you're kind of a transplant there and you're a transient. You're just there for a couple of years, and it would be easy to not incorporate yourself into the community or not get involved in things, but that's definitely a good solution and great advice there.
Physicians, are you looking for the right practice in the perfect community? We can help. Schedule a quick free call with a PracticeLink physician relations specialist today. We'll connect you with recruiters and help guide you toward the job and place of your dreams. Visit PracticeLink.com for more information.
So then overall, looking back at residency, what were your biggest hurdles in first year? I mean, I know there's the anticipation and the fear of just not knowing what to do, I'm sure, because now it's all hands-on, and there you are, right? You're practicing, and you're no longer in a classroom, and things are totally different. But what do you think was the major hurdles? What are things you look back on and you wish you had known in that first year?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think an important thing for us to note as well is that feeling, it may lessen some, but that feeling really doesn't go away. That feeling continues kind of regardless of where you are in training or life as an attending. That feeling is kind of always there. But I would say probably one of the biggest hurdles, Charlie, is you have so much core information you have to assimilate. You're balancing this with 80-hour work weeks, and you have core text you're supposed to be studying through. And the biggest thing when we were talking with first and second year medical school, you were learning how to learn when all you had to do was learn. Generally, you had small things outside of there, but residency, the challenge is figuring out how to learn when you have other responsibilities, when you have 80-hour work weeks, when you have family responsibilities, when you have holidays, when you have all of these additional things. Because it's not something like we were talking in undergrad that you could just cram and be good for. You have these in-training exams every year that you can't just spend 2 nights before cramming for it and expect you're going to be okay. It really has to be longitudinal learning. And figuring out that longitudinal learning method, again, was quite the challenge for me. It's something that I constantly kind of had to revise based on the evidence I would get. If I would do questions through one of the question banks and see that, hey, something repetitively keeps coming up. Why is this not really working the way I'm learning? Kind of have to go back and really apply a lot of the strategies I learned when I was at WVSOM with the Aspire Center there, just to figure out what works, to figure out now how to put all of this into practice. And that's something that even as an attending, I'm still doing. There'll be things that will come up that will just kind of come off the top of my head, and I'll be like, oh, where did that come from? And I'll remember way back in first year, the hematology unit when we were studying things, oh, that's where this comes from, and it's kind of that building of that skeleton for the human body that is the practice of medicine.
And then do you think back on your preceptors and some of the things they taught you, or maybe the way they carried themselves every day? Do you think back on some of them, or do you ever maintain contact with some of your preceptors from 3rd and 4th year clinical years in your medical education?
I do, and that's probably one of the things that brings me some great joy. Sometimes it'll be at 2, 3 in the morning when I'm in the ICU, and I'll be like, oh, hey, I got to teach on this thing you taught me about when we were in my 3rd year general surgery rotation, or hey, I had to stop this bleeding, and it was the way you taught me, so thank you for that, and it's nice.
That is nice. And what about now? Are you a preceptor? Do you have medical students that shadow you?
Yeah, so I work in an academic center. We have a residency and a medical school right on campus here. So we routinely have residents working with us as well as medical students. And that can kind of vary based on shift. In the ICU, we have residents. We will be having medical students starting to rotate with us. We actually just formed this as a brand new department within the hospital this year. So everything's kind of in flux with that. But no, I will have residents, medical students. Sometimes I'll even have undergraduate shadowing, which is always fun to kind of see that enthusiasm. And it reminds me of where I was. And it helps me kind of keep that little shine in my eye as well.
That's so nice. And yeah, I think that it's a great way to give back for sure. But it's also a good way to stay on your toes because the younger generations coming up through the ranks are on top of it and they know the latest things going on.
Because things are always changing. It's always fun when I recognize something that, I learned when I was a 1st or 2nd year medical student that now is very, very different in practice. And usually it comes as a result of teaching someone. And they'll be like, oh, hey, I just read this. And we'll look through and be like, oh, yeah, things have changed a little bit.
So you finish up residency and you apply for fellowships. So tell me about that experience. How was all that?
When I went into residency, I really thought that was going to be the end-all be-all for me. I did not think I was going to be doing any more graduate medical education. And it was actually probably in first year that I first realized that I may actually really enjoy the practice of critical care medicine in the ICU. It was something that I really wasn't sure how to go about. I have seen many people in the kind of medical education world that put out podcasts and that kind of stuff that practice in the ICU. I reached out to several of them previously, and unfortunately, I think with how busy their schedules are, I was not able to really get any information for how that process works. But luckily at Geisinger, one of my attendings was the first to go through the fellowship as an emergency medicine resident. I'll say that it's a fairly new process, so we're able to board in critical care in this direct route. It used to be a very circuitous path if you wanted to do this, and now we can kind of directly go through fellowship, take our board exams, and be boarded. So for me, the process was very similar to residency applications, except generally people don't apply to quite as many. It's a lot more tailored. The interviews at that time were all virtual. And I ended up really just falling in love with what made me fall in love with ICU, which was critical care at Geisinger. It was what I knew. Ended up ranking them very highly and staying there.
So that made an easier transition for you, and I'm sure that was a much easier process staying in the same place.
It certainly was. And it was very nice now to be able to train with a lot of the people that I still reach out to today who made me want to practice critical care medicine.
Very nice. How did you know that the job that you have accepted that you're currently doing, how did you know it was the right fit? Do you have any advice or tips for our listeners as far as knowing that it's the right fit?
I feel that searching for a job is a little different from when we apply to residency and fellowship in that we're really able to kind of seek out the practice that we're looking for. And you don't have to compromise what you are looking for just to have a job. And for me, I sat down and I looked at kind of what I wanted my practice pattern to look like. And that practice pattern for me included teaching, included, working with a residency, included my own practice that I wanted to keep up, which would include just me practicing medicine on my own without trainees in a more community setting. And when I interviewed down here, I saw kind of all of the things that I was looking for coming into practice. I saw all of the things that I wanted to be able to do in medicine in this position. Really did offer me kind of that secret sauce that I was looking for. But I think probably one of the biggest things is to know what you're looking for when you're looking for a job. Instead of just looking for, hey, I want an attending job in this specialty, look at what you want, whether that be hospital size, whether that be location, whether that be practice pattern. Do you want to be in an academic center? Do you want to be in a community center? Do you want to work with residents in your specialty, residents who rotate through your specialty that may not be in your specialty, medical students? Just figure out what that secret sauce is for you. Kind of like that non-negotiable list I was talking about when it came to the things I do for wellness. Do the same kind of thing for when you're looking for your job and don't settle, because you deserve to have an amazing practice.
That's good. When I travel around and talk to residents, and I kind of go through it like a 10-step process from creating a CV to negotiating a contract, and what all is in between. But a big part of that is finding the right fit. So what I always tell them is be very picky. It's okay from the start. Be as picky as you want to be. Put all your criteria down and say, this is exactly what I'm wanting. And if it doesn't, you can't fill all that. You can still open it up, right? You can open it up because everything else is left. But you should be picky. You should be very, very picky on what you want.
Right. And being picky does not necessarily burn bridges either. It's just you expressing what you want. And if that's able to be matched with where you're looking, that's amazing. And if not, you part in a cordial way.
It doesn't hurt that you landed in Greenville, which is such an incredible town. It's wonderful, right? It's one of the best towns, I think, in the country. I absolutely love Greenville. Just a great little town.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. My brother moved down this way about 6 years ago. And when I was looking at jobs, this job came up, and it was a pretty good fit for me. Kind of like I was describing with WVSOM. When I got down here, it felt like home.
So nice. Do you have any tips for references? If you were talking to residents now, what tips would you give them for choosing their references and how to go about asking them?
One of the things that I would recommend the most is to truly find a reference that knows you, because you don't want to have one of these just generic references that are giving just the generic information that comes through pretty transparently in the job hunt. References should be people that you should know their answer when you ask them to be a reference for you. It should not be one of these, They're hemming and hawing, deciding whether they'll be able to give you a reference, or you're not sure. And the most important thing, in addition to them being willing to give you a reference, is to be willing to give you a strong reference. And you should know that up front as well. Will this be somebody who will give me a strong reference? And if not, it's probably not the reference you want to be using.
Yeah, I think a lot of folks have that fear. I come across that a lot too, and that's why I ask about the references. Is it's almost like they're afraid of what the response may be, or there's always this hesitancy. So I think that's a very important topic.
Absolutely, because I think in our heart and our soul, we know the kind of relationships we have with people, and if it's so uncertain that we're really not sure what kind of reference that they're going to give, we probably should not be using them as a reference.
Right, exactly. I try to recommend to be careful when you get the higher ups, the folks that are, if you want to ask the CEO, that's okay, but your emails may get lost or not responded to in a timely manner. These are very busy folks that have a lot to do. So be cautious in that too. Make sure that they're going to be able to do things timely. Do you have any financial advice? Now, you don't have to answer this at all. Student loan debt is a huge thing for medical students, of course. Do you have any financial advice or guidance as far as getting through residency, or maybe some tips or tricks?
Still figuring that out. That's still a work in progress. One thing that I wish I would have done sooner would have been to set up a retirement account. If that is available when you are in training, kind of at any level, definitely get into that as soon as you can. Is one thing that I wish that I did sooner. I think everyone wishes they started contributing to their retirement a little sooner. But with how tight budgets are in residency, so often we're just getting through. We're just kind of doing what we need to do to get through. We'll worry about that later. And even just taking a little bit just to think about it early on would be super helpful.
That's probably something, again, that maybe isn't talked about much in medical school or residency too much, right? Is the financial piece, financial planning.
Right. And oftentimes when it is talked about, it's like you are a graduating resident going off into the world. Here's some financial advice. And I feel that's something that should be talked about sooner, because there are opportunities to leave yourself in a better position later in life by starting earlier.
Physicians, have you finished training and now you're job hunting? PracticeLink.com's Resource Center is packed with free tools to help. From creating your CV, interview prep, and even tips to ace that site visit, we've got you all covered. Visit PracticeLink.com's Resource Center today, and while you're there, create your free account to connect with employers and view exclusive job opportunities.
Any advice or any words of wisdom on contract negotiations? That's also one of those things that just, you say the words contract negotiation and it causes a tense reaction. So any words of advice on that?
I think first and foremost is not being afraid to negotiate, because I feel so often that people are afraid of that negotiations process because they feel, hey, if I ask for this, the position's just going to be withdrawn and kind of all of that stuff. When in reality, negotiations are a healthy part of any kind of relationship that's forming. And I think figuring out your non-negotiable list for that contract is very important. But then also having a professional in contracts look through it is also very important. Because I know for me, I know nothing about professional contracts going into this whole process. And there's a lot of firms kind of all across the country that specialize in this, that for a very nominal fee, it seems like a lot when you're a resident, but in the grand scheme of things, it's really not that much, for someone to look through. And at the very least, give you some of that peace of mind that, hey, there's nothing in here that I really need to be worried about, or there is something and we need to have a talk on this. Several of those companies that are out there in the world will actually negotiate on your behalf. So if you're someone that's a little more timid with that process, they will contact your people directly and just negotiate on your behalf. And then they do a very good job with that.
As far as timelines, so when you took your first job, how long did it take to get everything done? Your contract negotiation, your credentialing, all of that. Like, what would be, you think would be a good time frame for that?
So credentialing takes a long while, actually a lot longer than I realized. Credentialing can be a very lengthy process that has usually a pretty strict timeline. I think most people, they'll start looking for jobs. It was a lot earlier than I realized, but most places will talk to folks maybe 12 to 18 months before they graduate. Some will do it earlier, but I would say generally that's when most people start looking for their first job. The contract negotiations can occur typically after you'll have one or two in-person interviews. You'll get a contract to review. They'll give you a chance to review it, and then usually they'll have a deadline. They'll say, hey, review the contract, and this will be the date that we either need it signed or more conversation about this. Once you sign your contract, that's when the credentialing committee from the hospital will kind of come into play, and every hospital system does it a little differently. My first job, that was 90 days before you started your position, they started that credentialing process. In that credentialing process, they want to see certifications, they want to see procedure logs, they want to see patient logs, they want to see kind of all of your experience that will allow you to do what you need to do. Some of that will include communication with your current training program, so program director, program coordinator, where they will also sign off on different things to say that, yes, you can do the job you are seeking out to do. Generally, those credentialing folks they're very on top of what they need to do, and they'll get you there. But certainly it's not something to procrastinate. Kind of one of the biggest things I would say as a piece of advice is once you get that information on credentialing, do not ignore the deadlines. Those deadlines are very, very important, and do them as soon as you can.
Good words of wisdom. I think that's good advice. I think that when I travel, a lot of folks I talk to are in their last year residency, and they come up to me and we talk about the process in finding that first practice. And I always tell them, it's typically good 18 months before you finish up to start looking. For us, for PracticeLink, we are a job board. So we I feel like, take a lot of the work out of finding a position. You can go on our job board and just search for any open positions for physicians across the country and put in your criteria, and it just kind of takes some of the work out of it for you. Did you work with any recruiters during the process? And how was that?
So for kind of the first job I interviewed for, there was a recruiter involved in that process. One of the challenges for me, because the practice of EM critical care is very unique. There's not too many of us in the country that practice it. I mean, there's enough anymore, but a lot of recruiters weren't entirely familiar with the practice. So that made it a little challenging, where I would ask questions and they would just have to kind of get back to me with information. For this job, I actually networked with the department chair for the emergency department at one of the national conferences several years ago, and knew that he had planned to get this program up and running, and it would be around the time I was finishing fellowship. So I actually reached out to program leadership directly, and then worked with kind of the recruiter to help with some of the nuances with that whole process.
I mean, that brings up a good point. Something else that I try to talk about is, if you can afford it, it's not always affordable as a medical student or as a resident, but conferences. And that right there is a great example of why you should attend specialty conferences or medical conferences in general, right?
Yep. The networking that occurs in those conference settings can be so beneficial. You just don't know when they're going to become beneficial, because those connections you make, there's people I see at conferences year after year that now have become friends. That if I'm in a certain city, I know someone I could look up if I need a friendly face. Or in situations like this, where I meet somebody who tells me about this cool thing they're forming that then becomes a career for me.
It's so incredible. I go to a lot of conferences throughout the country, and it's amazing, the networking. And it's amazing to know how small the medical community actually is. And I always stress, don't burn bridges, because it really is a small world, especially with the medical community. It's a small world. What advice would you give overall to anyone listening who might be thinking about going to medical school, or maybe to a medical student, maybe to a resident? What advice would you give those folks listening? What tips would you give them before we wrap up?
I'll say one of the biggest things, and I feel like this can be a little cliche, but to enjoy the journey. I feel so often in education in general, we're always end goal focused. We're focused on getting to clinical rotations. We're focused on getting to residency. We're focused on getting to fellowship, getting our first job. And there's a lot of time in there that we could enjoy the journey. And enjoying that journey brings about connections that last a lifetime. Some of my best friends from medical school are still my best friends today, are still people that I just saw a classmate from medical school the other weekend, that these are the relationships that help you get through the struggles and the hurdles of the path to become a physician, because it's truly a marathon. And I think enjoying that journey and savoring it for what it is probably one of the biggest things that I still give advice to when I meet first-year med students that are just going through it, that are getting stressed, that just want to get through this exam or that exam, that just want to get to second year. Just to enjoy that process, because it is something that, certainly end goals are important, but so is the journey. And I feel that journey is what really adds meaning to the whole process. Kind of along those same lines would be to trust that you belong here. So I feel so often at every stage of medical training, medical education, medical practice, there's this concept of imposter syndrome that creeps in. Do I really belong here? As a first-year med student, did the admissions committee make the right decision to let me in? During residency, did I learn everything I needed to do with fellowship, with attendingship? Trust that you belong here.
Such a great thing to say, because I'm sure there is a lot of doubt. Anytime anything goes wrong, there's going to be doubt. My years working with medical students, goodness, I saw all the roller coasters of emotions and went through so much with medical students in third year and fourth year, whether it be just trouble on a rotation or just anxiety on that rotation or maybe a board failure. A board failure can wipe someone out. It can literally just take your wheels out from under you very quickly. And so that emotional roller coaster, I wish I could fix that for third year and fourth year, because you're just getting started. And I would tell students all the time, it's just a hurdle. It's just one hurdle. The biggest thing in your life right now is going to be this issue, but then in a few months, it's going to be this issue. And it's all part of the journey. So yeah, just embrace it and don't look too far ahead, but look a little bit ahead and just know that it's just a bunch of hurdles to get over, but once you're over them, it's a great life, right? You get to do what you really are passionate about doing.
And there's some great times on the other side of those hurdles.
For sure. Yeah, so what's next for you? You're happy in Greenville?
I'm loving Greenville, Charlie. It's a fantastic place to practice. I'm really just working on my practice as an attending physician now, which again, I think the common theme for me is just kind of learning how to always learn. And now disseminate that information. When I was at WVSOM, I did a teaching fellowship. I stayed there for an extra year doing that and really fell in love with medical education. Throughout COVID, that became very clear that was going to be my secret sauce to help me get through tough times. And now as an attending, it's something that I'm truly passionate about. I absolutely love medical education. And now, I'm teaching residents, I'm teaching medical students, I'm teaching learners kind of all stages. And for me, that's what I'm really enjoying right now. We're building a brand new department, which comes with its own kind of square wheels sometimes as they're rolling, but generally it's going phenomenally. And I am really just now working on that elusive concept of balance and well-being and trying to incorporate those non-negotiables again. Those non-negotiables never go away. I'm now just working on kind of refining the wellness so that my practice of medicine can be the best that it can be.
How about your osteopathic manipulation? Are you practicing OMT at all?
So manipulation is something that I do still practice. It's something that I don't necessarily have opportunity to practice in the clinical setting in the hospital. It's something usually that I will practice, at home with friends and family and that kind of stuff. There's several of us that really did fall in love with OMT in medical school and continue practicing it. And whenever we get together, we'll pull out our OMT table. My OMT table is actually sitting right next to me here off camera. So it is something that I still practice quite a bit.
That's so nice. I'm a big fan myself. When's your next trip to WVSOM? When are you going to head up to the school? And do you ever think about doing any presentations or maybe with midwinter or summer seminars, anything like that?
I would very much love to do that. I've been recently trying to figure out kind of when that could occur, but would very much like to make a trip back to WVSO. I'm not very far here in Greenville to Lewisburg, and got to get back home there to see my people.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, good. I'm going to tell them all that I got to talk to you today, and I can't thank you enough for all that you do every day. I know it's not the glamorous life that everybody just seems to think that physicians have. I know it's a lot of hard work, and I know how much sweat and tears you've put into being who you are today, but thanks for all that you do every day. It's truly appreciated, and thanks for being on our podcast.
Thank you very much, Charlie. This was wonderful.
Please come back anytime, and we'd love to have you. I'm hoping that we'll get a lot of listeners in the medical student and resident community, and hopefully we can help them out on their journey.